Well, as we continue our Lives of Courage series this week and next, I felt compelled first to round out my sabbatical experience, both to share it with you and to thank you for it. You heard a little bit of the detail in the children's story, but more detail is to come and to come and to come. We did move to Boston. I was the resident fellow at Harvard's Divinity School. I enjoyed it greatly. I read a lot, I studied. There's a bibliography of my sabbatical someone asked me for. I put it on the Welcome Center for those of you who are interested. I was exposed to so many offerings from the classes I took, to workshops with former Obama speechwriters, to collaborations on spirituality and technology at MIT and more. I did take a summer intensive class on strategic thinking for nonprofit leaders at the Harvard Business School, and then I took a semester-long class on power and influence, the successor of John Kotter's work at the business school. At the Kennedy School, I took a class on negotiation, which I felt was a necessary skill a CEO of a large nonprofit should have, and learned more about myself than about negotiation skills. More to roll that out in future Sundays. I also took a class with E.J. Dionne, as I mentioned last week, on politics and religion, and I was part of the teaching team in a class on innovation in ministry at the Divinity School. When I left Dallas, I said to you, sabbatical says that time is the presence of God, and the contemplation of who I am is a fearful response of finding something I do not wish to find, that I keep hidden in myself in my busyness, a terrifying prospect but a welcome invitation. In fact, I couldn't have imagined all the growing, all the confrontation with myself that I would do during the sabbatical. It offered me time, it offered me a lack of pressure, a lack of responsibility, and thus time to cultivate my family and my relationship with them and my relationship with the holy. It was good for my marriage, it was good for my parenting, for my mind and my heart, and my conversation with God and what matters in my life. I think I returned more inquisitive and less about problem solving. That's academia rubbing off for sure. More grounded, more committed to the work we do here, more oriented to moral leadership. I think the sabbatical designed to give me space to consider my ministry, to consider you, and deepened me as a leader. I think the sabbatical proved to me how strong our church is and how well prepared you have led me. My predecessor always said that good ministers are made by good congregations, and I think I realized how much I have learned from you while I taught and talked with divinity school students or problem-solved issues of the world with academics who lacked practical experience. I come back from sabbatical after a tremendous amount of learning and reflecting, and that reflecting continues, it will continue to roll out of me for some time. Upcoming sermons, I've committed to put a piece of each of those classes in each of the sermons. Today, Innovation in Ministry, a class that spoke to me as I studied mostly how people are finding their spiritual nourishment outside of the church. And I kept asking, but what about the church? So many come to places like this strong church to find spiritual nourishment and fellowship and community. And I thought about all the ways that this church innovates with our planning, our reaching out to people all over the world who are listening to this sermon. Our use of technology, our creating new paths of engagement with our faith-forward curriculum for churches across the nation, our social ventures that plan to extend the literacy around sexuality into the landscape of Dallas and addressing problems of teen pregnancy. This church is a church that innovates and always has. I realized America in itself is a church innovation. The people who came here to create our country were innovating against the structures of the church. And so I went deeper into innovation in ministry as my students went out into the world to study various spiritualities. I looked deeper at the church and what we offered. In the class, a young rabbi came to talk to us about changes he had made in his temple. He said 4 things are imperative that I thought were actually worked just as well in thinking about institutions as they do in thinking about our lives. He said faith communities, or people, can go no further in the same direction without making choices about where they are adapting, thinking about how adaptation is a necessary means to an end. He said right choices are not always self-evident. And so stepping back and looking for the answers is part of the spiritual quest. He said we have to find a fundamental issue or mission to live into. In business terms, he said that's the originating need of the customer. I would say this is about life. What is your originating need, the deepest need you must fulfill in your life? He said then we must bet our life and commit to projects that call us into deeper relationship with the mission that we can locate in our lives, in our institutions. He said something I thought could also apply to self-discipline and to parenting or to leading a business or leading in itself. He said that we always have inhibiting factors to a goal and promoting factors or incentives. But by a factor of 5, when we remove inhibiting factors rather than focus on incentives and promoting factors, we become more effective. In other words, in removing obstacles in our lives or work, rather than trying to promote ideas in ourselves or others, works far better at getting to a goal. Making life easier. I like that motto. Above all, the innovation class taught the students and the teachers that being courageous, even when we don't feel courageous, was the key to success. And that is what I want to talk about today. Courageous steps to change society come from faith communities that innovate in spaces that say we shouldn't be able to do it. Last week I talked about Martin Luther King, a reluctant leader in the civil rights movement. It was the church, it was the community of leaders around him who drove the heart of that movement, innovating in an impossible, dangerous, and threatening setting. I watched from Europe this summer the footage of Charlottesville, and the thing that stood out for me was the faith leaders lining the streets. I watched the Confederate monuments come down and saw you and my multi-faith colleagues standing up to hate, and I thought, that takes courage to face history, to face down evil, even when there's little confidence that it might make a change. I've always thought of this church as an innovator, a church that stood up when others stepped back. And one of the courageous lives who in his time stood what was for right was the namesake of our little chapel, Robert Raible. I spent many hours during my sabbatical reading Robert Raible's sermons that were given in this church between 1942 and 1964, a significant time of change and turbulence in our country. He preached mostly in Channing Hall because this pulpit wasn't here until 1964. His papers are housed in the Harvard Archive, and I read for hours as I tried to decipher both his handwriting and his coded shorthand with his theology. I want to tell you about his life as a focal point for a life of courage. Robert Raible was born the year this church was founded, in 1899. After graduating from the University of Kentucky in 1921, he started to become a farmer, but he suffered from an attack of poison ivy so severe that his mouth was swollen shut and he had to be fed through a tube. He gave up on being a farmer at that point. He worked in a bank in Louisville and then entered Harvard Divinity School. He said something in his papers that I read that I found interesting and apropos to my journey there. He said he went to the dean of Harvard Divinity School for advice about his degree, and the dean told him that the best use of his time was to memorize scripture and theology. Remember, this is the 1920s. So Raible thought about that and left the office and went down to Harvard Yard and enrolled in classes in practical learning and business administration. Raible came to our church in 1942. He was an active community leader, and he was elected, of all things, president of the Dallas Mental Health Association and the Dallas Council of Human Relations. In one of his most courageous acts of his ministry here in this church, in just the second year as minister, he went to the board of trustees and asked them to integrate the church. Remember, 1944. I think he had little confidence that this was going to be the decision of the board, to integrate in a segregated society. The debate at the board meeting went on, and at the end, they voted unanimously to be the first church in the city of Dallas, maybe in the state of Texas, to desegregate. After the vote, the board chair took Raible aside and asked him if the vote had gone the other way, would Raible have left the ministry? And Raible said yes. He had bet his ministry here on welcoming all people of all skin color into our church years before even our country would address this issue. Raible himself fought for desegregation in the Dallas schools because he believed that Unitarianism is preeminently the religion of democracy because of its emphasis on man, on human dignity, and on the importance of each individual, he said. He challenged the school system after Board versus Brown of Education had passed and publicly wrote in the Morning News, the board had 28 months to plan for desegregation and apparently still had no plan, he said. Gradualism, he added, was no longer the answer. Gradualism has come to mean never so long as it can be prevented. Gradualism is as passé as the Model T Ford, he said. It is an anachronism to an attempt to employ gradualism in a city as progressive and modern as Dallas, 1956. Raible encouraged the church to welcome outside organizations to use some of our church facilities. They included the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the Jewish Welfare Federation, the Republican Women's Club. The Republican Women's Club. In 1956, the church was permitted to use the facilities, permitted other organizations to use the facilities, the Dallas School for the Blind, a Baha'i group, the YMCA, the Kanter Society, State Fair 4-H group, Hadassah, B'nai B'rith, the League of Women Voters, a Brownie troop, the Girl Scout leaders, the Junior League, and many others. He wanted this place to be a community organizing resource, just like we are saying now in our strategic plan and our development of the center of our campus. What I learned was here was a leader from our church who had a deep spiritual side and a side committed to justice in his time. I found that his themes included Unitarian theology. He preached a lot about what we were about. Commitment was a major theme for him. And aging. I don't know exactly what he was struggling with, but he preached many sermons about aging. Maybe I'll try it. I couldn't help feeling close to Raible as I poured through his sermons. Because at one point I found an odd coincidence. I landed on a sermon in which he said that he had rode down the length of England on a bicycle. He returned again and again to this bicycle trip, because he saw on the wall of a church in Leicestershire a sign that said, in the year 1653, when all things sacred were through the nation either demolished or profaned. Sir Robert Shirley, Baronet, founded this church, whose singular praise is to have done the best things in the worst times and to have hoped for them at the most calamitous. Raible loved that sign because he said it reminded him of his times. It reminded him that we can do the best things in the worst times. He said it is hardly necessary to add that in many ways it is very easy to find unhappy parallels between that age and our own. And I would say the same today. He said something profound in that sermon that reminds me why we are continually building lives of courage in the church and movements of resistance and efforts in our big and small ways to make the world a little better. He said we build the church because we want to grow and mature with things of the Spirit, because we want to possess the values, human and divine, which this church can inculcate in us and in our children. No other institution, Raible said, on the face of the earth can possibly do this for us. Nothing else you can possibly buy, no other investment you can possibly make will ever repay you one iota of the satisfaction of any such commensurate return as the church will be refunding to you daily in the deep things of the Spirit, which it awakens and keeps alive in you, and also in its ability to serve your needs at the times of crisis in your life. You will hear those words again when we are fundraising next fall. But all the same, it's true. The church innovates. It encourages action. It encourages you to find a deep resource and deep well within you to live a life of courage and to be capitalizing on that investment here with each other in a return that is unlike any other place you can find. Raible also acknowledged that we don't always find ourselves in the situation of feeling courageous or ready to change. He said one of our greatest handicaps is our unwillingness to accept our own wholeness. That man was made not for the world as it is, but for the creativity which can transform the world. He said the Unitarian Church is a free faith for free people who can discover truth for themselves if open to inquiry. I think he knew that sometimes life got in the way of courage. That in the freedom to compose ourselves, sometimes we didn't feel as whole as he wanted us to feel. I think he knew that the marathon of the spiritual life was to continually seek the inner resources of the soul and the outer connection to God, to find ways to be courageous, to face our small changes in our lives or the big moments in the world. I think he knew as he preached in this church that we met difficult times in our lives, in our society, and the only way to confront those times was to see what wholeness we could cultivate and what ways we could join forces with each other for courage's sake. As I read Raible's papers, I got the sense that he knew that it took courage just to live. His theology pointed to things like faith as loyalty. Almost, I read in his papers, almost a chapter that's in my book, something I wish I knew before I wrote the book. He pointed to life as a teacher. And his theology is famously remembered with his statement that has been repeated to me many times, that people are precious. Precious gifts of God, precious potentials, precious hopes in times that are hard and calamitous, precious workers in the vineyard, precious gatherers of spirit, precious holders of love and each other. I think he knew, as Anne Sexton's poem says, it takes courage just to live our lives. She reminded us in our reading today, if you have endured great despair, then you did it alone, getting a transfusion from the fire, picking the scabs off your heart, then wringing it out like a sock. Next, my kinsman, you powdered your sorrow, you gave it a back rub, and then you covered it with a blanket, and after it had slept a while, it woke to the wings of the roses and was transformed. Raible and Sexton knew that we could transform our lack of courage into courage that transforms us. A spiritual journey that we take when we're paying attention. I was reading the work of Mia Mingus this week, a queer, physically disabled, transracial, transnational adoptee woman. She calls us to consider creating movements of change and making change in our lives with courage, even when we feel we are singular, alone, without cause, or incapable of any change at all. From the depths of our own souls, from the depths of her own oppression, she called us in the reading I read to rise in our hearts, to know that we can live courageous lives. And she says, as we march toward a world that we want to live in, how do we cultivate a kind of commitment to each other that can withstand failures, heartbreaks, disappointment, gossip, mistakes, and conflict? The kind of commitment to each other, she says, and love for one another that allows us to continue to leap together, knowing that we will fall and mess up and make mistakes and get bruised, knowing that we will have to brush ourselves off and climb back up the mountain and do it all over again. That is the commitment worth making, she says. How do we cultivate that kind of commitment? Mia Mingus asks. She answers with one word: together. Raible asks us, will we be baronets? Will we live our commitments with courage even when we don't feel courageous? Even when the world seems in a hot mess? If I learned one thing on sabbatical, it is that within us is a courage that is unceasing. Whether it is to go to foreign lands or to walk into classrooms with the smartest people in the world, or just to reflect on what life means, what matters, who are our people, where are we going, and why. Our courage is unceasing. If I have reflected about ministry and about life, it is to repeat the words of Mia Mingus, who could say this about each of us and all our work, that life is about falling down and getting back up, about spectacular failures and learning how we can get up and do life better. Resilience in the face of fear. Humility in the face of ego. Faith in the face of hopelessness. Those are some things I learned in one class on innovation and ministry and the papers of Robert Raible. There's so much more. It's good to be with you. I love you all. I love being back here in church. Amen and amen.